I need to be able to speak with you as if we're very close friends. Otherwise, there's no point. I need to talk to you about some of the criticism that we've heaped on ourselves over the years. And I want to talk to you about the development of our history, this juggernaut. Now, we have a history that is so convoluted and so mixed up with fact and myth that we're an absolute conspiracy theorist delight. That will come with us throughout time because we cannot erase it. One of the things you know about us is that we're practical individuals. If we need something, we'll build it. There was a time when Masonry was getting its foundation, was beginning to gel, where there wasn't Grand Lodges, there wasn't constitutions, although we know that constitutions for non-governmental organizations happened in Holland, we know that, about, 14th century? Before there was ritual, there was Masonry. And we know that the elements of that kind of organization predate the 18th century. And we can see elements of that go back into the earliest organizations and gatherings of men back somewhere around 15th century, 16th century. Men, just like you and I, good men, a bit level-headed, a bit contemplative, who were willing to challenge the status quo of the day, willing to, like boys always do, pick up the rock to see what's underneath it. And when you see the crawly things, you want to know what that's all about. People that had questions got together. And it started off very informal. The key to this was you had to have a bit of sense about yourself. And you had to have some questions about what was going on around you. That was all. That was the entry point. Masonry developed Grand Lodges, and we're facing 300 years, something like that? 301, 302, depending on who you talk to. Thank goodness, because the Grand Lodges formed the protection that you and I need in order to carry out the process of Masonry. I'm one of the people that believes that Masonry is far more profound than ritual, far more profound than meetings and schedules. That is something that penetrates the psyche and conscience of a man. And I'm going to talk to you about a particularly unusual fellow, Albert Pike. I need to talk about him to do justice to the topic of the Scottish Rite history and his profound impact on us. We created history, not only in what we actually did, but we created mythology. And it was needed. You've all know about Anderson and the first constitutions, and you know they were revised over and over again. And there were parts of history that were just sort of nicely fabricated, but they worked in the day. They worked in the day, perfectly fine. Now, the rules of plagiarism and borrowing were much different in days gone by than they are today. It wasn't a great crime. We needed an answer. He provided answers. But what happened, the dickens of it was, those myths, that sort of fabricated version of what went on before, were printed. Now, this is where we see historically this division and this question. Is that all there is? Before that, we were oral. Our history was oral. Our contact was from this fellow to me. And the validation was I trusted him to tell me and teach me everything that he knew about Masonry. It was essential. But civilization occurred. And when civilization occurs, we begin to do some very, very strange things. We organize. It's our nature to organize. And we start writing things down. If you want to know about that question, is that all there is? The root of it is when we started to write down our history. And if you're asking yourself if that is an essential question about the Scottish Rite, I'm going to try to prove to you today that it is absolutely inescapable. And that instead of feeling bad and burdened by it, you need to be able to hold yourself up and realize the challenge within that. Now, you know that there was something going on in Masonry in different parts of the world. And sort of an interesting phenomena. How did this stuff go on with the Germanic areas and go on in Britain and go on in France about the same time? How did it happen? Now, some of us were taught that all history was military history. And some of us were taught that all history is about dates. And then others of us were taught that history is about what happens around those dates and between those dates that makes dates and times relevant. And that's the kind of Mason that I am. The date doesn't matter. I want to know what you were doing back a couple of hundred years ago, because it was you guys that wrote this down, and it was you guys that produced the fantastically enriched philosophy and ritual that we experience today. We're still growing. Now just think for a second that we owe a great deal to people that brought Masonry across a great big pond. And some of you will know quite a bit about how the Scottish Rite was developed down around Jamaica, yeah? And then came from there into North America. Now, some of us are kind of curious. That's why I wore a little Masonic tartan tie today. Because we call it the Scottish Rite. But can you imagine what would happen in this room if I had worn my tartan today? There would have been outbreaks. There would have been, a rebellion. Because after all, we're members of the Scottish Rite, but it's nothing to do with Scotland. There's not a haggis in this room, I'll dare say. So you don't want to be messing around with that. That's a sacred cow. You don't want to be bringing too much Scotland into this room. But do you ever ask yourself how that happened? And you begin to also ask yourself, what is all of this French influence? And it's old as wood. Rose Croix. That's not English. How in the world did we get tied up with something that must have its roots in France, in Europe, and came over here? Fascinating reading, fascinating. I can't tell you that I've got through all of it. I'm more interested in why it bothered to come over here at all. Why would anybody start a ritual, a rite of Masonry in North America? One of the things about Masonry in North America is that you and I and we are an audacious group. We don't know when we need to leave good enough alone. If you want to get us to push back, all you have to do is start to tell us that we can't do what we're setting out to do. You put us in a room and try that stuff, and some very interesting things happen. We don't get angry. We don't call women nasty women. We hunker down. And that's the group I think I'm talking in front of here today. And I don't care if you're so sore like I am that sometimes you can't bend down and tie your shoes like you did when you were 20. which was a waste of energy. You still know what I'm talking about. We were all boys once, and we all had this attitude once. You want to stop that boy? Just tell him he can't do it. And by God. What brought us across was this notion of nationhood. Those Yanks down below us, they weren't pushing back against inclusion. They were pushing back against colonialism. They're saying, that's enough. That's not going to happen over here. You escape a class stratified Europe for a new uncharted area. Uncharted. It was absolutely frightening and breathtaking. An absolute new start. Only we, you and I, we're all proud of our heritage. We're all proud of our roots. So what would do Masonry justice in Europe than to have an audacious group start their own ritual, their own rite in North America for North America? Why would anybody do that? They would do it because they were starting their own history, just like you are today. One day this is going to be history. They wanted to start something profound, and they wanted to start something that would last. They wanted a ritual that would speak to this new group of adventurers. And I think they were successful. Now let's take a step back here and look at what's been going on here in Canada. We don't have the same kind of attitude about colonialism as our American friends did, the Republicans. We didn't need to borrow from smaller Republicans. We didn't need to borrow from France. We had France here. We didn't think they were such a bad lot. So we created a partnership. You spoke the French language, it's good with us. Works with the native folks, works with us. We had a different attitude. But how old, I want to ask you here, some of you might have been around at the start. How old is the country? I'm pretty sure I saw a picture out there about Connaught, and I'm pretty sure I saw some of your likenesses in the background of that painting. So we haven't even made 150 years yet, have we? In relative terms, we're youngsters. The whole country is young. We don't compare the Scottish Rite with what? The Masonry that went on around York for what, 700 years ago? We don't compare it that way. We have a different history, a different time frame. Only we're impatient. You think about what was going on in Britain when it was 150 years old, before Britain was even called Britain, or Alba was even called Alba. 150 years in, Europe was primitive by comparison. You and I, 149 years in, we're walking around with social media in our hands. The irony of it is, Masonry was the first manual social media. I didn't need this to connect with another community. My friend here taught me the signs. So I could walk into another community and you and I could identify ourselves. We were Masonically twittering before anybody even knew that we had these kind of capabilities. And now, 2016, we're as impatient as all. We want it all. In those early days, not that long ago, we were building roads. We were building schools. We were building churches. We were building factories. We were trading. And that's not that long ago. Our lodges were practical buildings. We didn't have marble. We built with the tools that we had at hand. And if you go around Ontario, you look and you'll see those original old buildings. And they look a bit odd, and the stairs are wobbly and creaky, and some of them are fire traps by today's standards. But we're one generation away. You give us 1,000 years, and we will have Europe. We will have that depth of culture. We will have that depth of art. We will have the arts in a profound way. And we will have a history of it. Just be patient. Now along comes this group that are very interested in developing a right here. Just bear with me. I'm going to read this very quickly. We're talking about a Grand Commander of the Scottish Rite. He had completed the rituals, liturgies, and ceremonies of the Scottish Rite in the year 1863. I have shirts that are that old. And he went on through 1868. And by 1870, they had all been printed and adopted as the official work of the Southern jurisdiction. The only serious opposition to his revision came from the York Rite bodies in Missouri. George Frank Gooley, Grand Commander of the Knights Templar in the state, had in early 1867 received Pike's Scottish revised work through the 32nd degree. In August of that same year, he wrote Pike objecting to the 29th and 30th degree of the Scottish rituals that revealed important secrets of the York Rite, and demanding that Pike have the Supreme Council decree that no Council of Kadosh, the Scottish Rite body having jurisdiction over the 19th, should receive as members any but Knights Templar. The beauty of Albert Pike, if you look at the format of the ritual are mystery plays, morality plays. He doesn't talk to us about huge belief patterns. What he talks to us about is human frailty. We bear witness to the challenges that men experience throughout time. Greed and avarice and hubris. And we're taught the best part of it. The best part of Albert Pike is that he brings about a resolution. He never leaves us hanging in a moral quandary. He always tells us, do the right thing, do the ethical thing, understand your ethics, no dilemma in life. You live a good life. Only he does it through ritual that's performed in front of us by relative amateurs, the same way that the mystery plays were originally performed, with all the warts and scars and imperfections, so that we actually have to want to be there. If you're expecting Broadway, you're going to be sorely disappointed. But if you're sitting there taking up a seat and you want to know what in the world is being taught to you, all you have to do is concentrate a little bit. And if you don't catch it all the first time, for goodness sakes, you come back and sit there another time and ask yourself the same question. The point, I'm going to wrap this up. The point is, we're part of an order that's called the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite. Only nobody really sits down and tells us what that idea of exception was about. What accepted? What accepted? When you were made a Mason, the idea of exception was that something was given to you. And on blind faith, in your own resolution, you took it. The exception from one to the next. The secret is, the great secret of Freemasonry is that even if you wanted to explain the exception, you couldn't, because it's an experience. It's like you telling me what it feels like the first time you picked up your child, or your wife looked up at you and smiled when she thought you were brilliant and funny. You know that moment? How do you explain that? It's here in your heart. Scottish Rite Masonry is exceptionally healthy. It has a responsibility to refer to itself as the University of Masonry, a notch above. You're worried about numbers? We don't have thousands of people lining up at our door today. You're worried about it? Some are seriously worried about it. We see all kinds of very interesting events going on to try and not recruit, but get more recruits. Just stop that. The one part about the Scottish Rite that isn't part of what Albert wrote to us was that we are in a constant state of renewal. Each and every time we have a class, each and every time we're together, we're reinforcing and acknowledging the values and principles and philosophy not only of Masons, but of this phenomenal ritual that Pike sorted out for us. Everything was chaos, he made sense of it. And every single year, you reinvent. The entire rite reinvents itself, always looking ahead, always looking higher. A man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? That's your burden. That's your challenge. You and I, with the support of the Scottish Rite, are obliged to always strive to do our best. Never quite reaching that gold ring, never quite getting there, but always striving for that. And it's that effort of constantly striving that makes us who we are. Not disappointed. Imagine what life would be like if we all had that gold ring. What would happen the next day? We'll never know. That constant stage of renewal is always with us, always has been. So I hope that when you leave today, you'll be encouraged that even to the last breath of the last one of us, that something very unusual, something very important and striking will continue to exist from man to man to man. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you very much for the opportunity.